All right, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Anti-ESG month is wrapping up on Capitol Hill. What is going on with ESG? Is the movement falling apart? What does the future look like for ESG? We have some very, very interesting updates for you on this topic. We're talking about all this and more on episode 408 of the In the Tank podcast. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal. Joining me today, I've got Justin Haskins, director of the Socialism Research Center here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
Doing very well. Very, very well. Excited to spend time with you guys, as always. I don't have anything more important to do. This is my most important thing. So I'm very excited. I'm feeling good.
That's right. Yeah, he got berated for missing that 1 week when the book came out, and he's learned his lesson, so he's back with full humility, wearing one of his classic hats.
Wearing one of my classic hats. You guys flogged me when I came back from Dallas and put me in the stocks, you know. Interestingly, I went to college. Actually, I didn't go to college in Williamsburg, Virginia, but my wife did, and we lived in Williamsburg together. And Williamsburg, Virginia is one of these places where they have like much of the downtown is colonial. And so they actually have the stocks still there. They keep the stocks there. So
nice. That's better than what they have down in Paris when they're sticking to their guillotines and all of that.
Correct.
But that's another
America
story.
Is better than France. No doubt about that.
Chris Talgo, editorial director at the Heartland Institute, is also joining us. How are you doing today, good sir?
Doing good, enjoying this very, very hot weather. I'm a big fan of the hot weather, so I'm loving the heat wave.
Ugh, no, I
loving it.
I could do without. Also joining us, a special guest for this week. We booted Jim off for the week because we needed to make room for Stone Washington, research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
Oh, I'm doing very good, Donald, and thank you so much for making the space for me on today's show.
That's right. Well, it came at Jim's expense, so it was a very easy decision for me. So Stone has done a lot of work on the issue of ESG, most recently writing a piece published at CEI talking about the efforts of the GOP's ESG working group. But we are going to get to all of that. Don't you worry. We have plenty of ESG stuff to get into. But before we get into anything, I have that message that I put out there at the beginning of all episodes, which is to encourage those people that are audio-only listeners that are probably catching the show on a Friday or later, that you can join us a day earlier on Thursdays at noon Central Time, where we are streaming on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Rumble. And you can join the conversation, throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we will address your comments. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. We will see. We also have that super chat functionality enabled if you want to guarantee your comment or question is read on the show. Also, if you are an audio-only listener, leaving a review for us on iTunes would be greatly appreciated. And those that are listening or watching, I should say, on YouTube and Rumble, if you hit that subscribe button, if you hit that share button, if you hit a like button, or just leave a comment under the video, all of those things help break through the big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. But gentlemen, ESG, obviously, very important stuff. Some of the stuff that we're going to get into is just wild, to use a term that Justin loves when I use. But before we get into any of that, it seems like there's been a lot of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden news breaking lately. We talked on the show a few weeks back about some of the stuff in regards to the FBI documents that seem to link Joe and Hunter to a bribery scandal with some Ukrainian oligarchs. Then there were some uncovered WhatsApp messages to businessmen in China from Hunter talking about how his dad was sitting right next to him and, you're going to feel the full fury of Joe Biden's wrath if you don't do what I say, that type of stuff. And I'm sure there was like 15 other things that have happened in the past couple of weeks in regard to this story. But now we have Hunter Biden's ex-business partner, Devon Archer, who is supposedly going to testify that Biden, amongst other things, but one of the things is that Biden was on speakerphone during some of these shady business calls with Hunter Biden and some of these, different, international business players. So, Chris, you were telling me about some of this stuff yesterday. Can you explain what's going on here?
So, earlier this week, the Hunter Biden's defense team and the prosecutors met in court, and they were supposed to agree to the plea agreement. But when the judge saw the plea agreement, she started asking a bunch of questions, and immediately the agreement it fell apart. And what ended up happening was Hunter Biden ended up pleading not guilty. He was arraigned on the counts for the gun charge and for tax evasion. And now they have until August 25th to re-put together the agreement. They can. Otherwise, it looks like this will go to trial, and looks like Hunter Biden could be in for a lot of trouble and a lot of jail time. And it looks like we could finally get to the bottom of the big guys role in all this. And it looks like the walls are closing in on the Bidens, and Donnie, even the mainstream media, the CNNs, MSNBCs, ABCs, NBCs, and CBSs are even reporting on this. So I think it has, made it into the mainstream media's, point of view. So I think that is a big, big move.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, some of the stories that I was reading off and some of the other stuff that I didn't even mention, it's, like the can you imagine if this was a Republican game is so boring. But is this amount of media cover of this type of corruption just unprecedented? Because it's seriously pretty wild stuff.
Totally unprecedented. I don't know. I mean, if you think about what happened with Benghazi, I mean, that was quite the scandal. I mean, you literally had an embassy that was under attack. It was raided. You had a cover up essentially of the issues related to security in Benghazi and what was known and what wasn't known. And then you had the Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, who had turns out she had a email server in her residence that was storing confidential and even classified information that was not something she was supposed to be doing. And then she covered that up and destroyed all the materials related to that and bleach bid everything. And then there was an investigation into that. And she basically lied and said that, oh no, I was only using the server for my yoga schedule or whatever the heck she was saying. And,
classic.
My daughter's wedding and that kind of stuff. And it turns out that wasn't the case. So, I mean, I don't know that it's completely unprecedented, but I will say that if you were to look at maybe the top 5 biggest scandals of the past 100 years, I think this is in the top 5. I mean, I definitely think it's solidly in the top 5. Not necessarily the Hunter personal issues. That's just, I'm sure there are lots of examples of family members of presidents or key political figures who have been, drug addicts and using prostitutes and bringing drugs into the White House. Well, maybe not all those things, but at least some of those things. And so I'm sure it's been a problem before. I've heard stories about, was it Billy Carter or Billy Clinton? Chris probably knows. He's
Billy Carter, Billy Beer.
Yeah, Billy Carter. Of course, Chris knows. Who was a horrible embarrassment to the Carter administration. So I mean, there's been things like that.
Yeah, I heard Andrew Jackson's cousin was a real wild one.
I'm sure he was. He's probably doing all kinds of crazy stuff at the brothels or whatever. But the difference is that you have Hunter Biden is not just out doing crazy criminal stuff. He is doing that, but he's also, in addition to doing that, seemingly engaging in all kinds of nefarious activities using his father, who was vice president and is now president of the United States, as the mechanism through which he's able to get these various business arrangements overseas and other things. It appears, based on the evidence that we have, which is very good evidence, that they brought in millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into the Biden family through various business arrangements overseas at the very least. And that Joe Biden personally benefited from this. It seems very clear from the evidence that we have that that was the case. He was getting a cut of the money. Hunter Biden was getting a cut of the money. Other family members were getting cuts of the money. This explains why the Biden family has rolling in cash for reasons we can't exactly understand. You literally have the CEO or the heads of some of these companies coming out and saying, yeah, Joe Biden was getting money. And so it's just like not really, this it doesn't require a ton of investigating at this point. It's pretty clear. It's just that the media has decided it's not an opportune time to go after Joe Biden. And so they're not. Well, there were whispers of that happening, and I think that might change, and we might see them, kill the Biden administration, and want to start putting somebody else involved, or somebody else in line to be president in 2024, 2025. But we haven't seen that happen quite yet.
I want to ask about that. But first, Stone, do you stay apprised of all this type of stuff when it comes to the political game and all the different corruption accusations and all of that?
Yes. So while it's not like kind of my primary focus in terms of keeping up with politics, I do keep up a little bit with what's going on with the Biden family accusations, and I've read a few of Peter Schweitzer's book. He's a notable investigative reporter, and he has uncovered a lot of information about kind of like the corrupt behind the scenes dealings of both Republican and Democrats in Congress and also in the executive branch. And from what I've seen in recent articles, it seems like that the Hunter Biden plea deal, and this kind of might be speculating on what the judge is looking at, but it seemed like it was kind of a tap on the wrist, like if this was like a regular person that had these charges, both the tax charges and the drug related issues brought against that individual, I think they would be doing some serious jail time and wouldn't have such leverage to be able to kind of use their political name to kind of ease out of a more like harmful charge. And so I think also in the recent congressional hearings, I think Representative Matt Gaetz did a really good job of questioning FBI Director Wray and the FBI's alarming involvement in this matter in terms of, I guess, serving like as a kind of like a buffer or a barrier to prevent a lot of the public from knowing about Hunter Biden's laptop and kind of what's involved on that. And I think that kind of equated to potential election interference because a number of voters would have probably changed their perspective on Joe Biden during the 2020 election had they known about these kind of secret overseas dealings in Ukraine and China and peddling millions of dollars to the Biden family to kind of use Joe Biden's position as a vice president to kind of as like a tool of political enrichment. And so I think that's very speculative. And as a researcher of public policy in terms of looking at the administrative state, I think the FBI having its involvement as not being a neutral party, but actually being kind of an advocate or an enforcer for Joe Biden's family, I think that's probably one of the biggest issues.
Yeah, no doubt.
Situation.
Yeah, I mean, Justin was telling me about this story regarding Hunter's art, and I think Hunter's art, his artistic ventures or whatever has become a bit of a joke. I think everyone kind of understands all of that, but he was telling me about the story about this big Democrat donor friend of the Bidens bought this piece of Hunter's art for like hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe like $1 million, some like crazy amount of money. And then this donor just happened to be appointed by President Biden to a commission for the preservation of America's heritage abroad. Some really, nice position up there, just months after she purchased the art. And I'm just like, come on, man. This is like comic book level corruption. Like, it's so obvious that it just seems like they don't even care to try to hide it. I bet that Hunter art piece that was purchased was just like shoved in that lady's trunk, never to be seen again, because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't buying art. The point was buying favor with the family of the person that could put you in a position like that. But it's just absolutely bizarre to me. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. Just a couple more things. So one of the things the judge said was she's not a rubber stamp, and she has, very questionable about this plea deal that was the sweetheart deal of all sweetheart deals, because as part of the plea agreement, Hunter Biden would receive broad immunity among for eternity among any of these affiliated charges that are still being investigated. We should also mention that Hunter Biden's legal team called the judge's clerk's office, impersonating the House Ways and Means Committee's office, asking that the 400-page amicus brief that the House Ways and Means Committee chairman submitted to the judge as part of the process, that she would look at all the evidence. They basically tried to get that, thrown off the docket. So she was very upset about that. She was, really surprised at how the plea agreement seemed to be so one-sided. And furthermore, she started asking a bunch of questions about how come he's not being charged with being a foreign, actor? How come, a foreign agent? How come that this broad-based immunity would apply even if a Republican president were to be elected in the future? So she had a lot of questions about this. And really what it did was it showed that there is a direct connection between the Justice Department and the IRS and all these federal executive agencies, really just trying to sweep these, crimes under the rug. The gun charge alone, that has been prosecuted time and time again. And, there are famous cases of rappers who have been charged with this and they went to jail. How come Hunter Biden doesn't have to go to jail? Same with the not paying taxes. Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, the House Ways and Means Committee has received $17 million from the, foreign countries, including China and Ukraine. They didn't pay taxes on that. And, Devon Archer is in hiding. He said that he is under threat for his life. And he is going to do a behind closed doors deposition. And they've leaked some of the testimony that he is prepared to say that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were intimately involved in this. Joe Biden knew about every single business deal. He was on the phone. They were on speakerphone. So once again, I do think this is possibly the beginning of the end for the Biden, crime family.
Yeah.
Wait, Justin, I'll let you have the final word on this, but I want to pitch a question to the audience because there was a talk between at least Justin, Chris, and I before the show that is the dam breaking? Is this too much crap to hold back, even for the establishment media and all of that? And it was just kind of wondering whether or not this is going to lead to the end of President Joe Biden's kind of re-election ambitions. So let me know what you think. Do you think that it's the end of Joe Biden's presidency, or at least, what he's not going to run next time? They're going to get somebody else. So say yes if you think that's the case. But if you do say yes, you have to propose who you think is going to be pushed by the Democrats as the person running for the presidency in 2024. If you don't think so, you think it's all going to be covered up, say that as much as well. But Justin, final words on this. I want to get to ESG.
Yeah, so just a real quick correction. I don't know that we know exactly when the donor who seems to have received a favor for buying the art, when they bought the art. I don't think we actually know that.
The one article I read said that it was months later that they were appointed. So.
Okay, well, I don't know, but the bottom line is it seems very suspicious. There's another person who bought, and the reason I'm bringing up the art thing again is because although all the stuff that is crazy that Chris was just referring to regarding, Burisma and some of these other companies overseas and shell corporations and the web of different companies that were set up with the Biden family to receive payments. Why would you do that, by the way, unless you're trying to hide something? But the reason I bring up the art thing is because it's that's happening now. They're getting money for the art now, while he's president right now. And people knew that it was happening and they asked about it specifically. And they said, oh, no, we're not going to, there's not going to be anything going on here. Don't worry. There's going to be this separation of Hunter's, art dealings. And Hunter Biden is not a famous artist. So it's ludicrous that this is the case. But there's one unknown. The fact that the media is not harping on this every single day after everything we saw with Donald Trump is amazing. There is one buyer. We know this from the actual records from the gallery, who has spent $875,000 on 11 pieces of artwork. And we don't know who this is. So somebody's buying almost $1 million worth of Hunter Biden art. And we don't know who that person is. And we don't know why they're doing it, other than I guess they just love Hunter Biden. They love his artwork. It's
he's the new Picasso. Just wait.
Right.
Just wait.
How is there not an investigation? How is it that they're not at least required to disclose this privately to somebody? I don't even understand why that question is not being. And forget about the legal implications of that. Why isn't the media at least demanding that they release this information so that we can know for sure that this isn't some sort of corruption? Like, they should at least be doing that. We heard how much about Trump's tax returns not being released. We heard about that for years. Demands after demand after demand that that Donald Trump releases tax records, which are private information, because we need to know. It's a threat to our democracy that we don't know. And yet here you have the son of the president, who's not an artist, receiving more than $1 million for crap art, and nobody seems to care. Like,
if we had time to cover it, the media would cover it. They've got more important things to cover. God. January 6th happened, 2 years ago? We got to cover that, Justin.
I know.
But no, I am seeing a couple of comments of people saying, yes, they do think that he's being pushed aside, making the way for Gavin Newsom. I've seen one person suggest Michelle Obama, although they didn't use that name. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I do want to get to our main topic. We're already 20 minutes in. ESG has taken a bit of a back seat lately after being at the forefront of a national discussion for a pretty long period of time. Over the course of, while that was kind of at the forefront of everybody's mind, we celebrated some great victories on the ESG front. And then I think a lot of people just kind of got complacent in this super important battle. Some people thought, all right, it's on its heels. I mean, even Larry Fink's kind of running away from the term, all right, let's focus on something else. But it's still a very important thing. And I'm curious, Stone, your kind of general thoughts about ESG before we get into some of these conversations, because the way that we've talked about it has always been in the context of the Great Reset, or the idea of stakeholder capitalism advocated by people like Larry Fink at BlackRock, or Brian Moynihan at Bank of America, to Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, that basically ESG is this tool that could be used to force the adoption of an agenda by society by co-opting corporations, creating a sort of social credit score for businesses. So we've always kind of talked about it in that kind of grand scale of things. But what's your perspective on ESG and its role in society?
Yes. So I think your interpretation of ESG is very accurate. I think that's spot on, certainly a modern iteration of ESG as it's being applied in a political sense. But I just want to say, and many people may not know, that ESG really isn't anything new. It currently stands for environmental social governance, but it's actually a form of value-driven ethical investing that's been around for at least over 100 years. I think maybe some of the earliest iterations might have been around the earlier 20th century. And it's you would hear it was mentioned in different names, like corporate social responsibility, or socially responsible investing, SRI or CSR. And it was mostly a way of companies thinking beyond just growing the value of their profits into actually producing some kind of visible benefit for the surrounding communities, or contributing to the environment in a positive manner. And it was a way to kind of encourage, like what you mentioned earlier, stakeholder capitalism, where people who don't have an active investment in the company are receiving some kind of social benefit that's non-financial in nature. And so I think the biggest difference between ESG, that earlier form of ESG, which was kind of like voluntarily encouraging philanthropists and business owners to kind of shift some of their focus to benefiting the environment and helping out social justice causes. What's different from that kind of voluntary form and today's form is that today's ESG is like basically a mandate by government to kind of push companies into adopting certain principles and standards that do away with the tradition of a shareholder-driven capitalist perspective that says that basically companies shouldn't be trying to focus on like their bottom line, but should be adopting like a triple bottom line, which is people, the planet, and I think the surrounding communities, and just kind of finding a way to basically coerce the true meaning of what a company should be focused on, and which Milton Friedman believed that the only responsibility that a company has is to its shareholders. And so I think we're just seeing now with certain government agencies even trying to adopt policies that promote ESG values in a mandatory perspective. That's very different from what we've seen, like kind of this more low-key, voluntary form of ESG that I mentioned in the 20th century.
Yeah, and even ESG, and I've mentioned this on the show before, but it was a topic that I know Heartland had covered very, very barely, prior to when me and Justin kind of get on the game and all of this, and the Great Reset really blew up. And it was just kind of like, I remember coming across these articles, and it's just like, it just kind of seemed like investment jargon, didn't seem that important or anything. But then as we started putting the pieces together when we were working on the Great Reset book with Glenn Beck, we realized that like the infrastructure that was put in place and these kind of mandatory aspects of it, as opposed to some voluntary thing that you were talking about, like really did equate to some like the machinery that was put in place had the potential to make wholesale changes across society, the economy in general, in a way of punishing corporations that weren't going along and rewarding ones that were. And I've always called it like the biggest cronyist system that's ever been created. And this type of messaging has resonated. A lot of people saw this for what it was, and it raised a lot of alarm. Similarly with lawmakers and policymakers and all of that have also saw that and have, in many cases actually like began action on pushing back against ESG. And then what we were seeing this month in July is anti-ESG month on Capitol Hill. But before we get into that, Chris, you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Stone, said in terms of the government side of ESG, but I also think that we cannot overlook the giant asset managers who control trillions and trillions of dollars. We've got the big three: BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And they are using that financial consolidation, that financial clout, to push companies who otherwise would want nothing to do with this to play ESG ball, because if they don't, well, then guess what? They are not going to have access to the trillions and trillions of dollars that these, giant asset management companies, have at their disposal. And but it's even worse than that. It's the insurance companies. Well, we won't give you insurance coverage if you don't play ball on the ESG front. So I think of it as like
the banks. The banks too. We won't give you any financial services or loans.
But it's important to remember that the asset management companies have controlling interests in the banks, as well as 95% of the S&P 500 companies. So that allows them to have like a vice grip, or the government's, from one end saying you better do this, and then the asset managers are also taking these companies and saying you better do this, or else you're going to go bankrupt because we aren't going to give you access to capital and access to grow your business. So I think of it as like just a vice grip that is just crushing any business that does not want to play ESG ball. And I think a lot of businesses actually don't, but they're being forced to.
Yeah, and another thing, this isn't reading between the lines. This isn't coming up with insinuations or anything like that based on, like, these are direct quotes. Like, we could pull up direct quotes. The reason why I put Brian Moynihan in there from Bank of America, notably, obviously it's a big bank and all of that, but there was some Davos type conference. I don't know if it was specifically Davos or just something hosted by the World Economic Forum, where he's like very specifically said, Like, if you don't play by the ESG rules, you won't get any loans. Like, you won't get the access to capital. Like, he like directly, I can find the quote. Like, he directly says that. So.
It was actually worse than just saying it at a conference. It was a letter that he sent, I think it was to CEOs. If it wasn't, it was to the shareholders, because he's done shareholder letters and he's done letters to the CEO. He does those every year. And and you're right. I mean, he said things like access to capital is a privilege. It's not a right. And we're going to, make sure that everybody is doing the things that we think are important. And this is how the free market works. This is what capitalism is. And he's made that abundantly clear that's going to be imposed. Right. You either are on the train or you're not on the train. You're either getting left behind and you're going to just sort of disintegrate into nothing, or you're going to play ball with us. That's how this has been presented to these CEOs of these big corporations, not just by BlackRock, but by banks and by central banks and others as well. They're all working together. They're all intermingled. They're all invested with each other. It's a public-private partnership. And that's why it's so powerful, and it's why we're seeing the transformations that we see today. This is, and you don't need to look far to find it. It's the reason why Amazon bans books that they don't like sometimes. It's the reason why Target bans books sometimes that they don't like. It's the reason why Bud Light is trying to sell, a beer that's traditionally only drunken by frat boys. It's using spokespeople who are, transgender men that, really don't have any, there is no group of people that are buying beer who find that person appealing. And so why are they doing that? The reason they're doing it is all because there is this pressure from investors, the big asset managers, from banks, from central banks, from government, all moving in that same direction. And when you have all those people working together, it is very, very hard for any company, no matter how big they are, to resist that. And that's why it's so dangerous.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, there is anti-ESG month going on at Capitol Hill. And I'll admit that I haven't really been keeping a close eye on what was going on during this supposed anti-ESG month, but Stone, I think that you commented that you were paying at least a little bit of attention to this. What's going on, and is it worth applauding these GOP representatives for whatever they're doing down there for anti-ESG month?
Yes. So I was in a financial services working group meeting in June, about mid-June, right before the Republicans announced that they were going to have this anti-ESG month. And I think what they're doing is very important work. It really, what inspired it was a critical report that the Republican ESG working group, which is basically a subgroup under the House Financial Services Committee, devised in February, which basically it serves as like a preliminary report of gathered research on the many harms and issues that are inherent with ESG, and specifically how ESG serves as a detriment to everyday retail investors, the kind of this everyday people who are just investing for their financial futures or their education or saving for the next generation. Many of these people don't really understand the different quagmires and pitfalls that are presented by ESG. And so what this Republican committee was, or working group was formed to do, was to just kind of basically gather research on what the kind of inherent issues are with ESG, specifically focused on the lack of transparency with proxy advisory firms, which is basically a duopoly of two major firms, Glass Lewis and ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services. And basically they're kind of like the consultants that are speaking in the ears of major asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, who then control, like, I guess, an outsized share of the equity markets. I think like over 70% of the S&P 500. And they're the ones that are kind of like the brainchild to push a lot of these kind of either like net zero initiatives or GHG targets that companies should adopt, or certain racial equity audits that are being conducted to I guess see like the different racial makeup of a company, or then of course requirements that a certain number of women or LGBTQ members should serve on the board of a company. All these different ESG measures are coming from these proxy advisory firms, but they're not registered with the SEC. They're not required to disclose their methods for making recommendations. And so that was one of the big issues in this critical report, was kind of requiring these firms to be more transparent in their methods, and also putting greater criteria in terms of making suggestions that are actually going to be financially successful for the companies that they're making the recommendations to, not that they're just trying to pursue these non-financial political objectives. And then another reason for this ESG month is something that I'm really studying a lot and I'm currently doing a research project on, is the Securities and Exchange Commission's climate disclosure rule, which basically you can understand that as being like a large mandatory ESG requirement that, in addition to what companies need to disclose in terms of their financial metrics, their kind of how much money they made in a given year, their net income, and other factors about the company, now public companies are required to disclose their environmental impact and how it kind of climate change risk bear on their decision to make investments, or how the board of directors kind of oversee climate risks when making decisions about the company. And so all this is just basically a large expansion of the definition of materiality, which is supposed to be what a reasonable investor would consider when making a decision to invest their money in a company or not. None of that actually includes concerns about the climate, or decarbonization, or whether I'm actually impacting the environment in a way that's negative because I'm investing in a oil or natural gas company or something like that. And so that really sparked a lot of concern amongst Republicans in this working group due to the SEC's actions. And that was on kind of the heels of a hearing that they did in April with Chairman Gary Gensler, who's basically kind of the brainchild of the climate disclosure rule, and has been a very controversial chair for the SEC in terms of pushing like a lot of pro ESG rules at the SEC. And so that's what this report really looks at in terms of just kind of promoting research that engages in what these many different issues in ESG are.
Donnie, that is such a great point, because when these businesses are forced to come up with these subjective climate impact reports, guess what? That means that they are having to divert resources, work time from actual endeavors that would be fruitful for the company, like research and development or other things. So this is also just making them less profitable by forcing them to take thousands of hours and also hire accounting firms to do these things. And guess what? Small businesses can't do it. So it's another way to just take small businesses out of the equation and further centralize power into big corporations, because they do have the wherewithal to
but when the machine is this big, putting money towards RNC or compliance with ESG is more important than research and development, because I found the quote. So I found the quote that I was referring to. So it was during Davos 2022, during the Global ESG and Global Resilience panel. Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, was very blunt about the intentions of ESG, saying, quote, "The ones that deliver on the metrics will get more capital. The ones that don't will get less. And that'll keep pushing people in that direction." So it's I'm not reading between the lines, folks. Like, this is the stated goals.
And it's a cottage industry in and of itself, because like Stone said, these groups like Glass Lewis and ISS, they're making hand over fist by providing these services, which actually don't benefit the consumer whatsoever, or the business at hand. However, they obviously benefit, the people who are at those firms, the McKinseys and all these, so-called consulting, firms that are now all in on ESG. They're making lots of money off of it.
Yeah, and Chris, you published a piece in the Center Square about the GOP-led House reintroducing the Ensuring Sound Guidance Act. Is that another step towards? Is that basically just like a PR thing? Like, again, just kind of raising the profile of this issue, or is there like real possibility of that becoming law? Well, tell us about it too.
It's not going to be become law with the Democrat-held Senate and Joe Biden in the Oval Office. However, I'm glad that they did reintroduce it, because I think that it is a bill that actually would have a positive impact on some of the things that we're talking about here, like the fact that it would basically bar these woke companies like the big asset management companies from considering non-financial factors when they are putting together their investment decisions. So I think it'd be a great boon for those of us who don't want ESG to cloud these companies and prevent them from actually pursuing profitable endeavors in services and products that the people want. So yeah, but obviously I think it's dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate. So
Sure.
we're gonna have to wait till at least 2025 till this thing has any sort of chance.
So, Justin, I got a couple of articles that I want to get into that really, I think, highlight just what the future of ESG is. But before I get into that, I want to give you an opportunity to talk on any of the things, maybe from that ensuring whatever guidance bill or the anti-ESG month going on. Do you have any comments on that stuff before I dive into these next couple articles?
Yeah, I mean, I think my main concern is that although I think all these things are important, and I think the investment side of things is really important, there are some really important key issues that are not necessarily being addressed with a lot of the legislation that's being proposed in Congress, although there are some good bills that have been floated out there. And in state legislatures across the country as well. It's important that investment decisions be based on investment considerations, and that you don't have investment management firms taking other people's money and assets and then using that to transform society in ways that they like. I mean, I think that that's important. But I mean, the thing that you mentioned earlier about banking from Brian Moynihan, the letter that I was talking about was from Larry Fink, not at BlackRock.
That's what I was
Brian
thinking.
Moynihan at Bank of America. But that's more important than the asset. I mean, the banking thing is actually, in my opinion, more important than even what BlackRock is doing and people like that. And the reason for that is because, although I guess you could say they're related, because BlackRock probably owns a big chunk of Bank of America, right? But banks, you can't, it's one thing to have investors like Larry Fink say, we really want you, ExxonMobil, to stop selling oil and gas. Like, that's really bad. And obviously that's important. But ExxonMobil, theoretically, if the other shareholders got together and said, no, we want ExxonMobil, an oil and gas company, to keep selling oil and gas. But if Bank of America says, and all the other large banks get together and say, no more loans, no more banking services, no more checking accounts, no more anything for you if you sell oil and gas, then you literally can't function. Like, it doesn't matter. All the shareholders could say, this is what we want. But if you can't get banking services, you can't exist as a business. So it's just not possible. And the payment service providers, same thing. If all the payment service, Visa and MasterCard and all those people get together and say, nope, sorry, we're not processing any payments for anybody who is engaged in this business, then you can't function in society in a consumer-based economy. So those people really do hold the keys to this. And unless you have rules in place that make sure that these people can't all collude together to drive whole industries out of business just because that's what they want, while they simultaneously have investments in competitors to ExxonMobil and other things like that. So they're going to make money off of this. And they're working hand in hand with government and central banks to make these transformations happen. Unless you have rules for that, then you're not going to fix the problem just by dealing with the investor side of things. That is important, but you got to deal with all the banking stuff too, which is why that quote from Brian Moynihan, Bank of America is maybe the biggest bank in the United States, depending on how you want to calculate that. If they're going to go in that direction and they're going to say, nope, we're just going to drive you out of business using banks, then you really can't survive. And that's so important for people to pay attention to that.
Yeah, there's this article.
That is such a great point. And also, Donnie, this, just like Justin was saying, the big banks and big asset management companies are preventing these oil and gas companies from opening up new drilling sites and new production sites, which means that they are, decreasing the amount of production available. They're also not allowing them to build the infrastructure, the pipelines and such that is needed to carry the stuff from the ground to the consumer. So
yeah.
It literally is a basically 20th century big business and big government getting together, colluding, and it's an antitrust.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely wild stuff. I mean, there's this article I was reading recently about like some of the arguments that investment firms were supposedly trying to make when defending their adherence to ESG as opposed to, basic fiduciary duties to maximize profits for their clients, yada, yada, yada. And basically the argument was, well, pursuing ESG aligned strategy is the best course in securing long-term maximizing profits. So we are actually still adhering to these financial fiduciary duties and all of that. And I forget like what article I was reading that was addressing this, but the author said something like, oh yeah, that would be an okay argument if there weren't so many people across all of these institutions specifically saying that ESG was a great way to change society. Like that's like very forefront, and all these people that are advocating for this type of thing in their rhetoric. And yeah, this is, like it's very true. We could find a million quotes, to this effect. In fact, I was reading an article published in the Aspen Times, and this is in the show notes, about an ESG summit that recently took place where one of the speakers said exactly this sort of thing. The article, which is like a glowing puff piece about this conference, and it ends with a quote of one of the speakers saying, ESG is no longer simply about managing risk, but how business can create value and drive change. So it's like, it's not about maximizing profits or anything. It's about creating change. And I think that this is something that like we cannot let them get away from. Like I refuse to cede the ground that ESG is something other than a way of trying to change society. Like you sold this whole imagining capitalism and rewarding companies that follow the agenda and punishing bad companies that do things that are deemed bad by the people that create the rules. Like that was part of your selling of this entire idea. So we cannot let them get away from that. And we've covered in length the way ESG is used to hurt entire industries like oil and gas. We've been talking about that. And I've always warned that these rules are all subjective and they're all, able to be changed on the whim, whenever the next Davos meeting or anything like that happens, that could undermine complete other industries or even, personal liberties. Well, I have a piece from Bloomberg that shows this point almost too well. Like it's almost as if I wrote it under a pseudonym or something, which I didn't, I promise. So in the article titled "Big Food Should Be ESG's Next Target," author Marin Somerset Webb asks, how many Diet Cokes are too many Diet Cokes? And if you sell too many, should you get an ESG downgrade or have a health offset of some kind, a Nutri-credit perhaps? If it would be bought from, say, the National Health Service in the UK or a gut health education group, that's not as ridiculous as it sounds, particularly if you are a big company going after a top ESG rating. So the rest of the article talks about the negative health effects of ultra-processed foods and its toll on the national health and the cost to society because of all of that, and how ESG doesn't adequately take this into account when it in terms of cost to society. So I mean, is it possible that ESG could one day add on some metrics that take into account the health effects of food products that are sold by companies? I don't think that's a stretch at all. And this is just an article showing that there are people that are proposing this exact sort of thing. So Stone, what is your reaction when you hear a proposal like this to greatly expand ESG's reach into a whole new set of industries?
Yes, I would say that's my understanding. That's very ridiculous, but also not unlike ESG in terms of it's such a. I understand it's like growth and outreach is kind of like very like cancer. It spreads to every different aspect of the broad areas that it looks at, to like environmental, social, and governance. And in this case, it would be under the S, the social category, which would consider just any way it can kind of micromanage, making suggestions for how individual Americans should kind of supervise their own like health and making these kind of subjective recommendations for, like the ideal way that they should kind of be monitoring their gut health and procuring certain foods. But I think that it covers a broader issue, which you all kind of touched upon a little bit earlier, in regards to the problem of ESG ratings. And these ESG rating firms, they basically produce these very highly subjective scores that aren't grounded in much of the understanding of kind of financial
like objective measurements.
Objective measures or metrics, right? Yeah, and it's basically I've read in certain studies that they only agree with each other like less than 35% of the time, at least among a lot of the major firms, like I think Moody's and MSCI and then ISS. They actually have their own firm. A lot of these, they always have their own special criteria that's built within their own subjective view of like what they believe is like the most ideal environmental organization or social justice driven organization or governance based one. And they basically, there's no like benchmark for like what's kind of like the standard across the board in terms of like what should be looked at for a company having a high ESG score versus a low one. And then like you mentioned, companies that receive low scores typically are denied access to loans. If you're an individual, you might be denied like a credit line or a bank account. Many people have been debanked who have already like had an established account at like a bank, like especially JP Morgan. I think they were in some hot water over debanking former Senator Sam Brownback for his criticism of communist China. And I think they kind of severed his bank account for no explanation because of that. And just, but also just because you can get like a low ESG score. And it's like, it's just a way of imposing these meaningless social credit scores that don't really have any like financial weight or connection to reality.
Yeah, and it's funny to me because like I was reading this article and just based off the headline, I was like, I can't believe this. And as I was reading it, I was just like, you know what? Like as vehemently as I disagree with all of the ESG stuff and any metrics that I could like take into place, no matter how good sounding they are and all of that, it's just like, this is more of a compelling argument, like targeting bad foods or something like that, ultra processed foods or all of that is a more compelling argument to me than the climate change justification for ESG. In fact, I think the ESG, they should just relabel the E for ESG and make it be eating instead of environmental. But it does highlight the fact that ESG can be expanded to take into account anything. And we're talking about health here. And, I'll bring up firearms again, because wasn't it not that long ago that the CDC adopted firearm violence as a public health problem? So is it really crazy that if we start getting into the public health aspect of all of this, putting it under the S column of ESG, that like firearms aren't going to find their place in there at one point? Like that, I really think that, like you said, this starts to kind of metastasize across everything. It could start off small, like any government program. It could start off small, and before you know it, it's got its tentacles into everything. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. I understand where you're coming from by saying that it could be beneficial for these companies to try to come down on these, junk food producers. However, I think that's a very slippery slope, and I don't think we should even go near that slope. Because first of all, who are they to determine what we should and shouldn't eat, and what? Oh yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not in support of this.
I know. But I think a lot of Americans kind of think, well, yeah, this is like smoking back in the day, and the evil tobacco companies were making people sick on purpose and making money off them, and that's terrible. Okay, but people have the choice to smoke cigarettes if they want. People have the choice to drink junk food and eat and drink that kind of stuff if they want. I'm a firm believer in choice, and not have the government have any sort of nanny state role whatsoever. It sounds good on its face because people will be healthier and we'll reduce healthcare costs and all this kind of stuff. But no, I think once you go down that road, there's no going back, and it's just going to lead to more and more micromanagement, which is, I think, one of the biggest aspects of ESG. And they're trying to do an end run. They're trying not to pass laws that say you can't do this, you can't do that, but they're using their financial clout. And I think that is so important to, like, for people to understand, to quote, nudge society in the direction that they see fit. But we must, not allow them to do that. And they do have the financial power to do that right now. And we need to just say no.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, the subjective nature of all of it. It's like, obviously there are certain foods that we can, everyone would agree on is on the healthy side of things. And there's a bunch of foods that everyone would agree on are on the unhealthy side of things. And there's a whole gray area in the middle. And maybe some people think that having meat in your diet's a good thing. Other people don't. Other people, tell their kids not to eat bugs. World Economic Forum is suggesting that you eat plenty of bugs. So it's like there's a big gray area. And, what things should be awarded some ESG points and which ones should result in deductions from ESG. Justin, do you want to comment on this, or do you want first swing at the next thing?
No, let's go to the next one.
All right, we are running out of time. So this is where we get into the real future of ESG. So first off, I want to acknowledge that the entire ESG concept is only possible with the use of fairly advanced technology. In the days prior to, high-speed internet, which really wasn't that long ago, the idea of collecting and analyzing this much data on this many companies to make a plethora of different business and financial decisions was just not even possible. It's only in the past few decades that this system itself is even a feasible system to try to operate your economy on. And the advancements in technology are only going to make this ESG system stronger and more intrusive and more controlling. So in a past episode, this had to have been a month and a half ago, something like that, we talked about a Forbes article titled, "Are You Ready for AI-Driven Radical ESG Transparency?" And that article discussed how AI tools were being crafted to further improve collection of data to give a clear image of a company's true ESG score. One of the tools, called Clarity AI, would, quote, dig around in companies' sustainability data and share back simple graphics and reports. Greenwatch AI compares companies' green claims against their actual carbon emissions, and other tools are also being crafted to detect greenwashing. In a recently released book that you might have heard of called Dark Future, we talked about how tools were being created to sift through companies' reports and board minutes to detect the tone and subject matter of these materials to determine just how serious these firms were to adhering to climate and other ESG goals. But I have a new one for you. This is something I just kind of came across the other day. I actually wrote an op-ed about it. It's unpublished, so you're getting a sneak peek here. In June, a global management consulting firm named A.T. Kearney announced a partnership with Al Gore's nonprofit Climate Trace. A.T. Kearney is a company that helps their clients establish and implement decarbonization strategies. And Al Gore's Climate Trace is a project that exists solely to track and identify sources of greenhouse gas emissions. How do they do this? Well, primarily with a network of 300 surveillance satellites and 11,000 air and ground sensors across the world. In their announcement article, A.T. Kearney explains how their partnership will essentially supercharge ESG. They write that ESG programs are only as good as the data behind them, and that using data supplied by Trace, they can give their clients a fuller picture of their carbon footprint, helping them better navigate the, quote, reporting requirements from governments and ESG investors. It's also important to note that A.T. Kearney is partners with the World Economic Forum. They have been since the 70s. They've authored papers together, and Kearney also hosted a series of panels at the 2019 Davos conference. So Al Gore, who serves on the World Economic Forum's board of trustees, he announced the plans for Climate Trace during Davos 2022. He talked about all of his surveillance satellites, not spy satellites. What am I talking about?
Same difference.
Same
difference. Come on.
So we have here a World Economic Forum ally, A.T. Kearney, partnering with a World Economic Forum ally, Al Gore Surveillance Satellites Program, to supercharge ESG, which is a focal point of the World Economic Forum's vision of the so-called stakeholder capitalism. Like, this is the future of ESG that we are venturing into. We're getting to a point in ESG compliance is going to be so enforced and so inescapable that pushing back against it is going to be futile. And all of these different tools are bolstering this machinery that I was talking about earlier. So, Stone, thoughts on that, or anything about the future of ESG? And please don't discontinue your work on ESG because of anything that I said that makes you feel powerless against this machine. What are your thoughts?
Oh no, Donald, you really did an excellent job presenting that very alarming issue with the World Economic Forum and that kind of secret collusion. I think what you said is very apt in terms of a lot of the future of ESG is going to be set by what's happening on the international stage. And just for some context, ESG, I believe that the market for ESG globally, I believe 80% of it is centered in Europe, and only like around 10 to 11% is in the US. And so a lot of what you see happening in the US is inspired by a lot of these international developments from the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, which is, I think, chaired by Michael Bloomberg, and then also what you're hearing from Klaus Schwab and the WEF, and also I believe the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero, that I think the companies that make up that oversee $100 trillion in assets under management. They're the ones kind of setting a lot of the criteria for what public companies in the U.S. should be looking to in terms of engaging in these kind of what they suggest should be voluntary ESG disclosures of what they do, and then also adopting ESG principles that are set by the UN and the IMF and other global institutions. And then our government is trying to kind of push the process forward by adopting these kind of mandatory policies, like what you're seeing with the SEC's climate disclosure rule. It's no longer enough for companies to just kind of voluntarily promote their own kind of sustainability report, but they're actually going to have to require them to do that in the future. But I think what's happening is that a lot of the standards are being set internationally. They're being adopted amongst many kind of idealistic progressives in the U.S. who are kind of trying to mandate a national-based ESG mandate that exists across the corporate boardrooms, but also are pushed by government entities like the SEC that doesn't have any statutory justification for regulating climate. And then also is pushed by a lot of private entities like the Glass Lewis and ISS, the proxy advisory firms, and then also the ESG rating companies. So it's like a broad version of corporatism, this right. Collusion between government and private companies to try to push this universal mandate.
What worries me is that a lot of European companies are saying that if you don't do this, then you can't be involved in our business, because if your supply chains don't don't reflect ESG ideology, well, then you can't do business in Europe. And the globalization that we live in today, U.S. companies can survive if they can't do business in Europe and these other places.
Justin, I apologize. I promised that you would get first whack at this topic. I know. But I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to give you a final word on everything that we've talked about. But this ESG system of the future, powered by AI and fed into by Al Gore's spy satellite network. We're seriously in are we in like a Mission Impossible movie right now? Is this a James Bond plot that we're unwittingly a part of? Like, this is getting crazy.
Yeah, but I mean, what people need to understand is, and this is why I've been so aggressive about ESG for the last few years. This is why I think it really needs to be destroyed. It doesn't need to be, maybe we can just tweak it to make it more, free market oriented or whatever. Like, everyone involved is actively designing ESG and promoting it and using it in increasingly more tyrannical ways, and in ways that are not market oriented. It happens all the time. And so in the book that Donnie and I worked on with Glenn Beck, Dark Future, we talk a lot about different ways that this is happening. One of the things that we do actually, I think, talk about Al Gore's spy satellite network in that book, although not in the way that you just described it, because we didn't have that information when we did it. But we also talk about how AI is going to be used. This is a real thing. There's people already talking about doing this, designing artificial intelligence so that they can take voice recordings of CEOs and other people at major corporations talking about their ESG initiatives and use AI to determine whether the tone of their voice is serious and whether we can trust what they're saying, and then build that into our ESG analyses. I mean, this is a real thing that people are actually doing to determine whether people are serious about ESG or not. Because, of course, anyone can just get up there and say that they support ESG, right? But how do we know they're telling the truth? Well, let's have AI analyze it. That's one way that we can do it. Another thing that they're doing is they're designing AI right from the very start, various AI systems, so that ESG metrics are built into AI so that the conclusion that AI gives you for any given particular problem has various ESG metrics built into that. So they're not just analyzing the data and then giving you the answer.
Oh, the AI got him.
AI got him.
AI got him. Skynet shut him down. That is a perfect way